Labor News Conference. Welcome to another edition of Labor News Conference, a public affairs program brought to you by the AFL-CIO. Labor News Conference brings together leading AFL-CIO representatives and ranking members of the press. Today's guest is Andrew J. B. Miller, Director of the AFL-CIO Department of Legislation. The second session of the 93rd Congress opened just a week ago. In the view of the AFL-CIO, few congressional sessions have faced tougher problems demanding action. How this Congress meets that challenge will make a deep impact on the shape of the nation and the world for many generations in the future. Here to question Mr. B. Miller about the AFL-CIO's congressional goals for 1974 and how he assesses the chance they will be achieved are Neil McNeil, Chief Congressional Correspondent for Time magazine, and Frank Swoboda, Labor and Economic Correspondent for Business Week magazine. Frank Hardin speaking. And now, Mr. Swoboda, I believe you have the first question.
Mr. B. Miller, it would seem unrealistic to talk about the outlook for any legislation without first discussing the impact of the whole impeachment question on Congress. How do you see this shaping up?
Well, I would certainly agree with your observation, because there isn't any question in talking with members of the House in particular that this is the matter that's uppermost on their minds. Actually, in my opinion, the timetable that has been laid out will probably be carried out. That toward the end of April, there will be an impeachment resolution reported from the Judiciary Committee. And I think it's worth noting, because I haven't seen this anyplace except in our own publications, that the precedents of the House of Representatives lay out very clearly what is an impeachable offense. In the precedents of the House of Representatives, Volume 6, Section 545, the following two sentences occur. Impeachable offenses are not confined to acts interdicted by the Constitution or the federal statutes, but include also acts not commonly defined as criminal or subject to indictment. Impeachment may be based on offenses of a political character, on gross betrayal of public interests, inexcusable neglect of duty, tyrannical abuse of power, and offenses of conduct tending to bring the office into disrepute. Now, certainly that is a wide latitude that is given to the Judiciary Committee to bring about a bill of impeachment. And in my opinion, there will be a bill.
I mean, you think the votes will be there, Mr. B. Miller, in the Judiciary Committee itself?
I do indeed.
What about the House, which is an entirely different place?
I think the House will also, if the matter ever gets in front of them, will vote for impeachment. The reason I say the word ever, I am still personally of the opinion that there's a good chance that if a bill of impeachment comes out of the Judiciary Committee, that there will be heavy pressure by Republican leadership on the president to resign and not let the matter come to a vote. There are many, many Republicans who, if you talk to them privately, admit they hope they'll never have to vote on this issue.
Are you saying, in effect, then, that you expect the president to resign?
This would be, in my opinion, the most likely thing that will happen, in spite of all of his protestations to the contrary. I haven't forgotten, for example, that Vice President Agnew wasn't going to resign or get into any trouble either. You remember his constant repetition. So the constant repetition that I will not resign, in my opinion, will not stand up.
Now that Congress is back, and you've had a chance to talk to them, Mr. B. Miller, on the assumption, say, that the president does not resign, if you get into the impeachment proceedings, what does that do to the legislative calendar, for one thing, and what does it do to normal Republican support for the White House?
Well, it, of course, will make for confusion in the House if they have to proceed constantly under the threat of still maybe having to act on impeachment. But I think that they will go ahead with a calendar, because the other thing that seems plain in talking with members of the House on their return from the recess is that the country is very angry at the president on the whole question of what's happened to the economy, and are mad at both the president and the oil companies on the energy issue. And I think that the House realizes, and the Senate as well, that there has to be action in these areas. I think the hearings last week conducted by Senator Jackson on the oil companies has produced a climate of opinion in which very definitely there is going to be legislation passed clipping the oil companies in many directions.
Mr. Beamer, let me ask you what the AFL-CIO is actually doing on the impeachment process. You have, of course, very actively been advocating the president's impeachment. What have you been doing in specific terms dealing with the members of Congress themselves?
Well, we have distributed several million pieces of literature, and I am sure that members of the Congress are hearing from our members on the problem of impeachment. We're doing nothing unusual. We're doing the usual thing we do on any major matter before the Congress, and that is bringing pressure from our folks back home on their members, urging them to take, in this case, the action of impeachment of the president.
How effective is that?
We've always
Do you
found
have
it.
any sense of what's happening off that pressure now?
All I can tell you is that I run into members who admit that they've been talking with our people and that they are hearing from them now. This is the only method I know of that you do on any piece of legislation. There's no magic way of carrying on a question of lobbying on anything, including impeachment.
What
You
I
just
wanted
go
to
ahead and do it.
really get to, assuming the president does not resign under any circumstances, as he has claimed he will not, the key seems to me to be the Republican votes. He cannot be impeached. He cannot be convicted of an impeachment without Republican votes. What, in your judgment, will the Republicans do in the House on an impeachment vote? Will there be a substantial number?
I think a substantial number will vote for impeachment if they have to vote on the grounds that this is the only way of clearing up the whole question. After all, remember that impeachment doesn't mean conviction. This is simply saying that, in our opinion, there are grave enough charges that they ought to be heard before the Senate. And I think this will be the out that will be taken. We have made this point ourselves in some of our own literature, that really, in one sense, the president ought to welcome an impeachment proceeding, because it's the only chance he's ever going to have to clear up the feeling in the country that the White House has been guilty of all kinds of offenses against the body politic.
Mr. B. Miller, Peter Rodino, the chairman of the House Judiciary Committee, said recently that unless he were to get the information gathered by the special prosecutor, Mr. Jaworski, that it might take at least a year to come to the point you say they may come to in April. What happens if he doesn't get that information? He goes beyond April. What do you see? What do you see it doing to the elections and again to the Republican votes?
Well, on the elections, I think by now most observers are pretty certain that there's going to be a big fall off in the Republican vote, particularly if this matter drags on and if the White House remains as stubborn as it is at the present time. After all, only recently, as you will recall, Mr. Swoboda, Senator Goldwater suggested there'd be a 10% fall off on the Republican vote. A 10% fall off would mean an overwhelming Democratic Congress. And I think many Republicans fear this situation, and that's why they want to get ahead with the business.
Well, do you think the election itself, the pending election, plus the difficulties the president is in with the population on the fuel crisis, on inflation, that also will have a pronounced effect on the vote in the Congress on impeachment?
Yes, I think definitely it will.
That the president is being hurt, for example, by the
Yes,
fuel shortage?
He's being hurt very badly by the fuel shortage, by inflation, by the stagnation of the economy, rising unemployment, which we think is going to get worse week by week. And all of these factors, in my opinion, lead to the fact that there's a chance of the Democrats really having a tremendous sweep in the election this fall.
Well, Mr. B. Miller, we're back to a situation that was rather unprecedented at the start of this administration, that is high inflation, continued inflation, very high inflation, and the prospects of a parallel recession. What is the AFL-CIO planning to do with regard to such matters as economic wage price controls and as far as the energy bill goes?
On energy, we will definitely be trying, first of all, to make certain that there is power around to deal with things like rationing. That is the minimum type of thing that has to be done, and that the allocations program be fairly administered, because otherwise there's going to be a slowdown in industry as a whole. Furthermore, we are certainly going to make every effort we can to stop the ridiculous situation of the big oil companies getting a credit on their taxes by paying foreign taxes. Today, the effective rate on the oil industry as a whole in the United States is about 8.8%. running as low as 1.6, and in a couple of instances going up to about 15 or 16%. That is because every dollar that they give to the Arabian sheiks is credited against their U.S. income tax. And there's every reason to believe that as the price of Arabian oil goes up, that unless there is some reform made in this situation, the American oil companies who are engaged in foreign enterprises will pay absolutely no income tax in the United States. The increase in the price means the increase in the so-called foreign tax, and which is really in many cases royalties, but labeled as tax, and they'll wipe out their American tax structure completely.
Mr. B. Miller, there's testimony already that the oil companies have made extraordinary profits last year, and there's a push underway to pass an excess profits bill. How do you define excess profits, and do you think this will go through Congress?
Well, you've got the model, of course, of the excess profits tax of the Korean War situation. You can date this, the effective date of it at any time that the Congress wants to. There is a precedent for going back and picking up the 73 profits as well as profits in the future. And that would have an effective rate of about 85% on the oil taxes, or the oil profits. But tied with it has got to be the denial of the foreign tax credit. Otherwise, there aren't going to be any taxes, in spite of the fact that they admit these huge profits they're making.
This brings us into
So an excess profits tax has got to deal with this problem, as well as simply a normal excess profits type of operation.
You're really talking about the tip of the trade iceberg, too, are you not, in this area?
Indeed we are. I think the Senate will undoubtedly completely rework the House trade bill. I think this is a brand new ballgame as far as trade is concerned. And I know that there are many members of the Senate Finance Committee who take this same point of view and are in effect going to start from scratch when the hearings, which I think will start within 30 days or so, on trade in the Senate get underway.
Well, there's a lot of talk, even within the administration, of the need to at least consider export controls on certain commodity shortages. Do you think this is playing into your hands legislatively?
Very definitely. I think within the almost immediate future, there will be a battle in the Senate on the question of export controls. A bill was reported during the last session and was then mysteriously pulled back to committee at the request of the administration. The administration can't quite make up its mind what it wants to do with export controls. But I know that there are many members of the Senate who are just waiting for that export control bill to be once more brought out and put on the calendar and acted on in the Senate, and there will be many amendments. Now, we've got all kinds of problems with export. I think by now most people recognize that the Russian wheat deal is to a very large extent responsible for our problems with the price of food, for example, in the United States. We also are suffering all kinds of shortages because of exports of American materials. For example, there's a serious shortage of scrap steel at the present time. Our paper people tell us that there's a serious shortage there. The Japanese are paying $90 a ton for waste paper when the going price in this country has been around $40 a ton.
Mr. B. Miller, talking of shortages, from your own sources within organized labor, can you tell us whether there really is an oil shortage?
I don't think anybody really knows the answer to that, and part of the problem has been the difficulty of getting information. This is the beginning of getting information, I think started, that is good information, started last week with the Senate Investigating Committee. And I think that from now on we may begin to get some information. Now you get all kinds of conflicting stories. There is some evidence, for example, that the airlines have more fuel today than they did a year ago, and yet they're cutting back on flights. If it can be established that the airlines have more fuel than they today than they did a year ago, then I think the CAB had better step in and see why these flights are being canceled. And our people who in the unions in the airline industry are quite concerned about this problem. But there is evidence that we have been talking about for almost a decade, that we knew we were headed for a real problem in oil shortages because of the increasing dependence on Arabian oil. And once that embargo becomes effective, and I'm afraid that it is now becoming effective for the first time, there is going to be a serious problem of enough oil in this country. We should immediately be going ahead with the kind of a program that Senator Jackson laid out a long time ago for a crash program of research into our own sources of oil, into shale oil, into the use of coal turned into oil and gas, and all this kind of thing which can be done. Energy sources can also come from some rather esoteric things in the future, from solar power, thermal power, and the like. And these are the things we have to get at.
I'll turn you back to the impeachment process for a moment, Mr. B. Miller. A great number of the members of Congress are claiming this is in effect, a judicial process in Congress. In the House, they're claiming they're grand jurors. Does your union feel any hesitation in lobbying in such an area?
Well, we obviously are going ahead. Our convention was the first organization in convention assembled that called for the impeachment of the President of the United States, and we certainly don't intend to slow up on that issue.
You don't have any sense then of an impropriety which some members are trying to put on this in the interference of the lobbying
We think as
operation?
citizens we are guaranteed the right to voice our opinion, and that's what we're doing.
Do you detect that sense of impropriety on the part of any other lobbying group? Or a sense of impropriety?
I think I've seen some tactics on the part of some other groups that I wouldn't approve of, but I think they've got a perfect right to express themselves.
Well, what about Vice President Ford? Now, he's charged that, in effect, there's a conspiracy of the president's critics.
Well, that's the most ridiculous charge I
afoot,
ever
and that they're
heard.
trying to undo the 1972 election.
That's the most ridiculous charge I ever heard of. In the first place, we were neutral in the 1972 election, so that nobody can accuse us of having a vendetta on here.
Were you sorry you were neutral?
Not at all. We think the situation at the time called for the position that we took, and but we also think, for example, that if we hadn't taken that position, it is possible there had been a landslide in the Congress, and then you might not have ever had any investigation of the whole Watergate thing, which is a point I think some people forget about every now and then. But I think, by and large, we have laid the foundation for proceeding with impeachment. We have laid the foundation for the Congress to go ahead on its own and get very busy with legislation that is badly needed. We expect to, again, have a minimum wage bill, for example, before this session of the Congress. We're going to proceed very rapidly in the field of health insurance. And as far as taxes are concerned, it isn't only the oil taxes that bother us, but we need a tax reform bill in this country, as is evidenced by the President's own income tax difficulties.
Mr. B. Miller, if you get that 10% fall off that Senator Goldwater talks about, how do you translate that into numbers? What kind of a House and Senate do you see?
Well, that would mean that 10% fall off could add as many as 60 Democrats. If there are about 30 more Democrats elected, I think then we would get the veto-proof Congress that we're looking for. That has been one of the great difficulties of the first session of this
What
Congress.
about Vice President Ford? Is he acceptable to organize labor as president?
He is
in the
more
event of
acceptable than President Nixon because at least we think he's an honest man and we want an honest president.
Would you be willing to give him any kind of a legislative honeymoon were he to become president?
Well, I think that would just almost automatically appear for a short time.
How
But
short?
I don't know. I haven't any idea, but I don't think it would last too long.
You don't then think there'd be a great shock at the removal of President Nixon, as his own people are claiming?
Not in my opinion.
Thank you, gentlemen. Today's Labor News Conference guest was Andrew J. B. Miller, director of the AFL-CIO's Department of Legislation. Representing the press were Frank Swoboda of Business Week magazine and Neil McNeil of Time magazine. Frank Harden speaking, inviting you to listen again next week. Labor News Conference is a public affairs production of the AFL-CIO, produced in cooperation with the Mutual Broadcasting System.